Hi there, Nick here from Conservation Careers and welcome to the podcast. What does it take to rewild a nation and how can rewilding also regenerate communities and economies? And what's the future of rewilding in terms of a career path? Well, today's guest is Rebecca Wrigley, who's the co-founder and chief executive of Rewilding Britain, who has over 23 years experience in conservation and community development. Rebecca has led Rewilding Britain's mission to restore species-rich habitats across 30% of land and sea by 2030. In this episode, we explore the principles of rewilding, how Rewilding Britain is empowering landowners and policymakers, and the key challenges and opportunities in large and small-scale nature restoration projects. Rebecca also shares her career journey, her advice for aspiring rewilders perhaps like yourself, and insights on building a movement that balances ecological restoration with economic sustainability. It's an inspiring, it's a hopeful, and it's a solutions-driven podcast. Enjoy.
So I'm Rebecca Wrigley and I'm the Chief Executive of Rewilding Britain.
Wonderful. Well, nice to meet you. Thanks for joining the podcast, Rebecca. I'm going to be really interested to kind of hear more about Rewilding Britain and your career and your advice as well. Where to start? Well, I thought a good place to start is before diving into what is Rewilding Britain, could you just give us like a little bit of an overview as what is rewilding? It's a word that many of us have heard of. I think if you're interested in conservation or working in conservation, it's a really interesting space. It's a topic that's kind of captured lots of people's imagination. But yeah, just in case people aren't super clear, what is rewilding? How would you describe it?
So rewilding is the mass restoration of naturally functioning ecosystems to the point where they can start to take care of themselves. So it's about reinstating natural processes and missing species where that's appropriate, but it's also about working with people and nature. So we feel that people are very much part of nature, not separate from. And so it's all about finding a balance that works both for the local people and communities, ensuring that we have economic models that support the restoration of nature just as much as ecological models.
Got you. So it's about bringing people into it as well, not necessarily keeping people away, but working with local communities to allow nature to restore itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know how important nature is for human well-being, for instance, and so restoring nature is about restoring our living systems, our life support systems, and so we need to Rewilding Britain very much takes a kind of systems approach, as it were. We need to look at the whole system and how we can shift it so that the balance between so we kind of recalibrate almost the balance between people and nature.
Got you. Okay. What I find really interesting with rewilding is this idea, I think maybe it's just even in the term itself, that conservation feels like we're sort of maintaining things, we're conserving, it's sort of status quo, holding on, if you want for a better word, whereas it feels like rewilding links to kind of restoration, it's about improving, it's about sort of bringing back and allowing nature to kind of take back hold, and that intuitively feels really exciting. And as someone who wants to see nature thrive, as we all do, as many of us do, just that concept, that idea of kind of allowing, nature to come back is so exciting. Like, what do you find personally exciting about rewilding, the concept? And you've been leading the organisation now for 11 years, according to LinkedIn. Yeah, so obviously you like the work and that sort of area. But what do you find exciting about rewilding as an area of work?
I mean, fundamentally, it's really hopeful, I think, and it's about releasing nature. It's about reinstating those wonderful webs of life that form. That nature is very good at forming, and they're dynamic and ever changing. And so the difference between maybe more traditional conservation approaches and rewilding is about reinstating natural processes and then letting nature do its thing.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily orientated towards one species or one habitat, because we don't know what might return. If we put back in those natural processes like free flowing rivers and natural dynamics between predators and prey and natural mixes of sort of herbivores, so that there's disturbance and things are ever changing, and it creates this sort of multitude of niches into which lots of wildlife can live. And what we have in Britain at the moment is overly sort of degraded and simplified ecosystems that just don't have those full webs of life.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we all kind of inherently know that, because when we watch David Attenborough documentaries, we kind of see it through a screen and think, wow, that looks amazing. But I don't think we're very good at connecting what we see through a screen and what's happening outside our windows.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, and I love that as well, like releasing nature. Yeah. Rather than, I guess, controlling and being clear on a goal and where you're getting to. This is about not knowing what the outcome's going to be, but letting nature take its course. Yeah.
And not to, I mean, I think one of my problems with the whole orientation towards specific habitats and species is that we don't know what mixture of, it doesn't really matter what, what particular habitat, whether it's a heathland or a woodland, because naturally functioning ecosystems are amazing mixtures of the two, that sort of blend and change and are constantly dynamic. And so what we want to see is those healthy living systems that then therefore become much more resilient to changes, whether that be climate or weather or and so we get these sort of resilient but constantly changing and colourful mosaics of habitats. That's what we would like to see return.
Lovely. Yeah. And turning then to Rewilding Britain and actually linking very much to what you're just talking about there. So your goal, I was reading your website, I guess the overarching goal is a mosaic of species-rich habitats restored and connected across at least 30% of Britain's land and sea by 2030. There's kind of 30 by 30 target that many organisations are kind of lined with. I was wondering if you just give us an idea of how you're going about achieving that really kind of ambitious, that really exciting goal. Like what sort of programs or strategies are you kind of playing out to help kind of drive you towards that?
So we largely do three things. We help catalyse rewilding. So we have a rewilding network, for instance, that now has over 1,000 members and covers an area of land around 180,000 hectares. And it's a real variety and diversity of different kind of approaches. From the large scale, over 1,000 hectares, we might have private landowners, but we also have community landowners, for instance, that are driving ecological restoration and community regeneration. But we also have much smaller scale members, 3-4 hectares. And so what we're helping to do is create this sort of community of practice, this sense of peer learning and solidarity and sharing, so that we can put some of these practices into practice and learn from them, share them, and so that they start to become just an accepted way of managing the land and sea. So that's one thing. We also influence, so we want to create an enabling context for rewilding, which might be policy change, but it might be research priorities or technology that supports rewilding. And then we engage people. So we want those that may own land or work on the sea to be involved, but also those that might not, people that live in urban areas, for instance, so that people can feel connected and a sense of involvement, almost like a kind of rewilding movement. And ultimately, we want to see rewilding just mainstreamed into the way that we manage the land and sea. It's just another option. It's not seen as separate, and it helps us to deliver what we're asking of the land and sea in the 21st century, which of course is around food production and timber production, but it is also about meeting our climate commitments and our nature restoration commitments, ensuring human health and well-being, ensuring flood mitigation. So the challenges that we're facing currently are very different from 50 years ago, and we have to adapt and evolve our approach to land and marine management accordingly.
I find I hadn't quite appreciated the kind of the different scales that you're working at in terms of rewilding. I think intuitively, my assumption is rewilding is like a big scale thing. Everything's tens of thousands of acres and hectares, but you're talking there can be small pockets of land as well, and small areas and small numbers of people, and learning from those different scales. Yeah, I was wondering, like, could you give some examples of maybe one or two projects that Rewilding Britain's been involved with to kind of bring it to life? Maybe pick a small one and a big one if that helps. And how rewilding has sort of changed, or what changes you see like across the lifetime of some of these projects, please.
I mean, again, a great diversity. The one that probably most people are familiar is the Knepp estate. I mean, partly because of the book Wilding and now the film Wilding,
Yeah.
where you can actually sort of see how that's changed and evolved over time, and quite quickly as well. In 10, 15 years, it's changed from farmland to, what is starting to look like the African bush in many ways. It's much more scrubby and messy and complex and full of species. But that's just one example. We're also working with the Langham Initiative in southern Scotland, which was a community buyout of an ex-grouse shooting estate. And so the community own the land and are leading, again, nature's restoration alongside community regeneration. So that's a really exciting and completely different sort of project over thousands of hectares. But then we have lots of small scale projects. For instance, we have an innovation fund to do what it says. In a sense, it is to help that kind of innovation. And we recently awarded funding to the Scouts, for instance, to rewild some of the areas of land they own, but also sort of connect young people to rewilding and engage young people. So that's a different type of project, I suppose. And then we have lots of smaller scale projects and urban projects. And I think the scale, while true rewilding requires larger scale for those natural processes to be restored, actually you can achieve that through connectivity, for instance. I mean, what we would love to see is people able to step from their front door out into maybe an area of rewilded park, through a river corridor, out into the countryside and out into sort of larger areas of land. And let's not forget marine rewilding as well. We'd love to see areas where they're left to restore themselves, where there is no trawling and dredging, where people can enjoy being on the sea and seeing the species return. I mean, I live in Devon, and I was lucky enough that locally you can see bluefin tuna who've now returned to British seas, and you can literally see them standing on a headland and they're jumping and leaping out of the water within 20 meters. It's quite phenomenal. So again, it's about engaging people in those experiences that we might associate with far-flung places that people might go to, but actually should be happening around Britain.
Yeah, and I think that connects to the hope that you were talking about too, and the speed of change you talked there about Knepp as well, how things come back really rapidly. People think about Knepp. I've got the book actually over there. I know it's blurred out, but Wilding is there, and it talks obviously about turtle doves coming back rapidly, bluefin tuna now coming back rapidly. It feels like if you get the balance right and allow nature to take its course, there's huge hope in that idea that things do return really quickly and hope isn't lost. Change can kind of revert back, and yeah, it's a really exciting kind of concept to be working within, I think. Yeah.
And there's also all sorts of economic activities that can be associated with rewilding. I mean, we've looked into the kind of idea of nature-based economies, for instance. If we want 30% rewilding when nature is restoring and we're prioritizing natural processes, we also have to have local economies that support that and that communities and local people can benefit from. And so that can be, often people think, oh, well, that's just tourism, isn't it? Whereas actually there is forms of meat production, for instance, and production of venison, for instance, which has to go in the absence of wolves and other predators. Actually, we need to control deer numbers more. And at the moment, we're importing venison from New Zealand, for instance, when we should be linking wild caught venison into the food chain, so that can be part of a kind of nature-based enterprise. For instance, some forms of timber production are compatible with rewilding, so it can be an impetus for regeneration and for sustaining and diversifying livelihoods as well as regenerating nature.
So important, yeah. I'd love to, I'm conscious of time, so what I'd like to do is kind of talk about you and your role as well. Firstly, as chief executive, as you've been for 11 years, and then also about your career path as well. So let's start with your role as chief executive. What's your job really like? Like, how do you describe it to people who don't know who you are and what you do? Like, bring a role like yours to life for us a little bit, please.
It's kind of difficult to answer for Rewilding Britain because I helped found the organisation 11 years ago, and we were like two people at that point. Well, in fact, we started with a few people doing it on a pro bono basis, and in 11 years, we're now just over 30 people. So my role has changed quite considerably, but relatively gradually. And I've now got a fantastic senior leadership team who are incredibly supportive, and a wider staff team. And so my role is moving more into thought leadership, I suppose. It's trying to, see the next step or the next two steps ahead, and where we might move into, and how can we just maintaining that bigger picture of, if we're wanting to see 30% rewilding, where are the changes that need to happen? What are the levers that we can pull? Connecting with people, finding out where other people's energy is, and where there's synergy with what we're doing, and how we can collaborate. Because our ethos is very much to achieve things through helping to catalyse and enable others. I mean, we deliberately don't own land or manage land, for instance, because we feel that we can have much more impact by influencing and supporting those that do. So that's sort of networking, influencing, being a ambassador for Rewilding Britain, and kind of that thought leadership role is what I mainly do now.
Yeah, yeah, and amazing to hear it's grown from 2 to 30. So you're obviously doing something really right, and having to evolve and keep up with that organisation as it grows, I guess. I was really interested in a couple of things actually when I was just preparing for the interview today. One is your values as an organisation, which are visionary, inspiring, pioneering, collaborative. You just spoken to. And credible as well. You've got 5 values that are laid out there. I also noticed that you're an associate coach. You've done coaching. You have a coaching background, which aligns quite a lot to values, and being aware of that. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to the importance of values in an organisation. How are those 5 values useful to Rewilding Britain? How do you use them, or how your staff use them? Like, why even have values?
I mean, I think they're kind of fundamental, really, in many senses, but particularly for an organisation like Rewilding Britain, where because we're looking at big changes and the role that we can play within those big changes, and that shifts all the time. I mean, who would have imagined 6 months ago that we'd be rolling back on many of our climate and nature commitments? Well, globally, the global context has shifted, and that's had an impact on us in the UK, and that's had an impact on us as an organisation. So we're constantly having to shift and change, but you need to have some sort of bedrock of, it's almost like, what's the principles that you bring, or that we bring to our approach? Because that's what provides the sort of solidity, I suppose, the stability. It kind of almost encompasses, in a sense, what our approach is to achieving the change that we want to see. So I see that both personally and organisationally as vitally important.
Yeah, I really like that. And you're right. I mean, we're seeing, change happening so rapidly at the moment in terms of how people view nature, and how governments want to conserve it, and how businesses interact with it. So having almost like the compass, I guess, is what I'm feeling when you talk about values. Yeah. It sort of gives you that direction, the clarity as to how you approach everything. Yeah. Just going back to your team, so there's 30 of you now, give or take, in the organisation. Could you just paint a little bit of a picture as to the different types of roles and skills that you have within a kind of an organisation like yours? Like who are you sort of hiring? What's valued, within a team like Rewilding Britain?
So we have what is in effect a policy and practice team. So some people support the Rewilding Network, for instance. We also offer some funding pots. I've mentioned the Innovation Fund, which is smaller scale, but we also have an annual challenge fund, which is £100,000 with the view to helping a project scale up in terms of area, but also in terms of ambition. So it's and then we have one of the areas that we've grown is our policy influencing team. So we now have 4 people, 1 in each nation and 1 covering marine rewilding. So that's a really important aspect of, and growing aspect of our work that's growing in importance. But so is our communications and engagement team. So one of the key things that we have realised is critical is what you might call normalising rewilding. If we want it to be just part of the way that we manage the land and sea, that's about kind of a shifting paradigm and mindsets, and that's about kind of communications and engagement. And so we're growing that team as well. How do you inform but also engage and shift the way that people see rewilding and the place it has in our world? And I suppose we consider ourselves as across that as being quite creative, being quite willing to be bold, and to, I'm not sure I really like the think outside the box phrase, but you know what I mean, kind of take unusual approaches, adapt as we go along. And that suits some people. Some people thrive and love that. I mean, I personally do. Some people like things to be a bit more predictable, I suppose. That's not us. We don't do, I mean, not in all of our jobs, but so I think
what I'm hearing is like agile. Is that a useful word?
Yes. And I think some people, again, some people love that context and environment, and other people struggle with it. And I think we've got better at kind of identifying or recruiting people that will really thrive in that environment.
Yeah. What does your recruitment process look like, if I can ask? Like, what could you share around that when you're shortlisting or interviewing? Are there things that you do that maybe are unique to you, or anything that people might learn from that?
Oh, that's a good question. I suppose it's more, I mean, I think we probably use quite a normal process in terms of application and interview. I suppose it's more about as we've grown, getting a better sense of the. I suppose recruiting almost for values rather than and sort of mindset rather than qualifications, and getting a sense of or orientating particularly our interviews towards getting that sense of people.
Yeah. I think that's why I was asking the question, actually. Yeah, it feels like if you want people who are going to thrive within an agile setting and you have these particular values, then you've got the skills you're looking for. But really, you're trying to find the people that are going to fit, aren't you? And it's like, how do you approach that? Yeah, really interesting. As chief exec, like going back to your role again, if I might, what do you sort of enjoy about the work that you do? And are there any challenges you'd like to share? Again, just not many people get to have a role like yours, and it's ever evolving and changing. But are there particular things that you do that you really relish? Are there things that you enjoy? And are there any things you want to share with an audience that you find particularly challenging?
So I suppose what I relish is it's quite a creative role, and in a smaller organisation that is, and the kind of space we occupy allows, again, it allows that agility. It allows us to give ourselves permission to do things differently. I think one of the things, for instance, I mean, I come from a background in conservation development and spent 10 years working overseas, and so I've seen things from a very different perspective, and so I've been able to, I mean, particularly, so for example, when I was working in Mexico, I worked for primarily for a conservation organization, but there most of the land is communally owned, and so you can't go in and tell people what to do on their land. It's all about, in a sense, it comes back to that coaching process. It's a process of working with communities to help them see the resources that they have and see how they can, how they want to manage them and the benefits they gain from them. So it's a very different process from what might be seen as sort of traditional conservation in the UK. So I think I bring that perspective. And I think I'm also naturally a kind of big picture thinker. I'm much more comfortable when I understand how things fit into a kind of a big picture. And what I really like is the the ability to be creative about, again, how we achieve our goals, and networking and meeting a whole range of different people that might be the kind of usual suspects, but might be people that might not have thought would be where they might not have thought that we'd have synergy. And what I love is that kind of, and then again, finding the energy and the interesting ideas and sort of bringing people together, and that idea that you can kind of bring something together as more than the sum of its parts, rather than ideas competing with each other. That's the space that I really enjoy, and that ability to do that. So the challenging, I mean, I suppose it's a good question. I think it is when I mean, the people, our team is vital for that, and when the team, it's almost, again, it's that sort of more than the sum of its parts. When you get things right, it's like this well-oiled machine, and it's with the I mean, some people have said that that idea of sort of punching above a weight, you can achieve incredible things when that's not quite the case, and that might be a combination of reasons of not quite the right person that's the right fit, or so I think that's when, and that creates dissonance, and that's quite difficult to manage. So I suppose that's probably the more challenging. I mean, we have had, not everyone embraces rewilding, and so we've had conflict in that sense as well. So and again, ultimately, as the chief executive, I'm responsible for everything and everyone. So the buck stops with me, and sometimes that can be quite exhausting.
I bet it can. Yeah. And you're beholden to your board, I guess. So you're reporting back through to those people. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. You've touched on there about your career as well, and you worked and lived abroad for 10 years in Mexico. I believe New Zealand, Uganda as well, possibly elsewhere. I've probably missed some. Could you just give us what have been your key milestones when you look back at your career? Like, what have you done that stands out, that's maybe even helped to get you to where you are today?
So I think the first thing to say is I didn't do the right university degree.
Okay.
So I took careers advice that was, it was interesting because the careers advice was, I found biology easy, thought I'd do biology, didn't really know what I wanted to do. And a careers advisor said, "Oh, don't do biology. It's not specific, it's too general." And so I ended up doing genetics, which, I mean, again, with hindsight looking back, is quite laughable because it's really, I'm not a details person. I like the big picture, and I like sort of psychology and what makes people tick and how you can change behaviors. And but I thought I'd finish it just because I didn't know what else I wanted to do. So I think that's this kind of lesson in not worrying too much about each step, because you can always reorientate. And then I traveled for a year and realized that what I really wanted to do was work overseas. And I mean, I suppose I always felt passionate about nature and conservation. And so not easy to do with a genetics degree. So I then did a master's degree in rural development and environmental policy. So again, you can reorientate, you can change depending on where your own energy is. And luckily enough that the college that I did that master's in had a connection with Mexico. So I just thought, I'll go to Mexico. So I went there for the first 2 years and just had a really amazing experience, in effect, learning, kind of learning how not to do development. So I worked in a Mayan, but I learned a lot about local communities overseas. I worked in a Mayan community, and then came back to the UK and was looking for the next job, and had a year when I was really couldn't find the next job. So again, there's a lesson in, I mean, I did volunteering work and I got knocked back a few times. And, I was lucky enough to be able to live with my parents, go back and live with my parents. I was that boomerang child. But eventually got another job back in Mexico. So it's kind of, again, don't lose faith. And yeah, so that worked with the World Wildlife Fund back in Mexico again. So I spent 6 years there, which was amazing. It's an amazing country full of challenges, but delights as well. And then, I suppose I've never really understood the concept of a career path, because there was very definitely not a path I was following. It was more whatever the next step seems interesting at the time. And one thing has led to another. So even starting Rewilding Britain, that came about because of the interest that the book Feral, written by George Monbiot, when that came out, various people contacted him. I happened to be, I had a small child at the time, had just been made redundant, and helped out when people came together and started talking about wanting to do something about rewilding. So it was never in my, and I think if it was never in my career plan, because I've never had one. And then it's interesting, if you'd asked me 10 years ago where I thought we'd be in 10 years' time, I'm not sure what I would have said, but I don't think I would have said the organisation as it is now with 30 people.
Oh, I've got about 20 questions I could ask. What's the process been like of setting up Rewilding Britain? I think that's something I'm really interested in. Like, how did you go about it? Where did that idea come from? There might be loads of people listening thinking, I'd love to start my own organisation. I've got this passion for this thing. What steps have you taken, or what lessons have you learned even? Yeah.
Another good question. I mean, at the start, as I've said, was the interest and impetus that was generated by that book. And then, a few people got together, started talking about making something happen. And I think when the thought of actually setting up an organisation came about, it was one of those moments where everyone else starts looking at their feet, and I happen to be looking up. And I had no experience in setting up an organisation, so we all those involved, we kind of made it up as we went along. So again, and you start off doing everything from literally registering it with the Charity Commission to trying to get funding, to working out what it was how it could add value, what would we be doing, and yeah, so it was. I mean, I suppose it's in many ways been steady growth, because 10 years is not a long time to get to the point where you've got 30 people, but with lots of challenges along the way. And there's no manual to say this is how you do it
yet.
So I suppose what has been critical is finding kind of both peers and mentors that have helped along the way, and I mean particularly also a board of trustees that have been, I mean they've changed along that path, but have just been an incredible support.
Yeah. Where did your first funding come from? Like, how did you sort of get off the ground financially? Yeah, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about that.
Well, we had one foundation that committed some funding, but they required us to get match funding, so which quite rightly. And then so there was quite a long period of trying to find the additional funding, which God, I'm trying to remember. I think critically came from the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, which, I mean, there are some foundations that are, very mindful and of supporting young organisations or smaller organisations that might not, because they're young and haven't got a track record, might be a bit more risky. So it's that sort of funder that we went to initially. But what again has been amazing is that we've been able to diversify our funding sources. So we've got regular givers who give £5 a month, and are also sort of supporters of Rewilding Britain. We continue to get funding from trusts and foundations. Now corporate partnerships, which is increasingly important, but again has its implications in terms of having an ethical funding policy and making sure we're not being funded by those that don't share the values that we have, I suppose, and some major donations. So, and I think one of the critical things is largely most of that funding has been core funding, so what's called unrestricted, which has supported our ability to be agile, because we haven't kind of defined outputs per year to say, well, this is what we're going to do for the next 3 years, and getting restricted funding for that pot. So I think that's been a lesson that it's very lucky that we've been able to do that, but it's also supported our ability to achieve what we have achieved.
Yeah, it comes back to the strategy, really, doesn't it? And core funding is the hardest funding to raise, but the most important, isn't it, when you run an organisation? Because it's flexible and you can use it as you need to, as you see best fit. Careers advice. If people are listening, and we already have people listening right now, we'll turn to questions in 10 minutes or so. What advice would you give someone who's maybe at university or looking to switch careers, they're aspiring conservationists? Like, what advice would you give them if they're looking to maybe become a rewilding professional?
Such a difficult question to answer. Again, particularly looking at, with what I said about not really understanding what a career path is, and really only ever thinking one step ahead, if that, actually. So I suppose it's more about what not to worry about rather than concrete advice. I mean, as I mentioned, I shouldn't really have done a genetics degree, but that was fine. I think I should have taken a year off before going to university, because I think going straight from school, you have no experience of kind of life. And hitting a pause then might have allowed me to understand a bit more about what I was interested in. And I think, again, gaining a bit of experience. Volunteering is always good, but not everyone. The challenge with it is not everyone can do that. Because I think quite often, my sense is that there aren't very clearly defined career paths anymore. Everyone has to sort of navigate for themselves. And I think we're led to believe if you don't get that kind of, if you're not already on the path by the time you're in your early 20s, something's gone wrong. Whereas I was, I still don't, still not on a defined path, and had quite long periods of time in the middle, like I was explaining, that sort of year between jobs, where I was quite clear, what I wanted to eventually be doing, but wasn't quite. It didn't become clear, and I didn't get that kind of next job for a year, and so I did volunteering jobs and a few jobs to earn some money to keep myself going. So I suppose, and I think there are probably skills within rewilding. I think there are, like, coming at it from a kind of enterprise angle. I think that is a really interesting aspect. Again, there's not a defined career path for that, and at the moment, there aren't that many people with the expertise in advising rewilding initiatives on business modelling, for instance, and what could be the combination of nature-based enterprises that would support or financing rewilding. So I suppose, what does that boil down to in terms of advice? Focus on what you feel passionately about, and where, you know, what you feel some energy around. Don't worry too much if you take missteps along the way, or like myself, take a degree that I realized wasn't what I wanted to be doing, but I then reorientated myself, and that's fine. I think sideways steps are often better than always trying to go up the career ladder. Does that? I think.
Beautifully, yeah. There's loads in there. Absolutely, yeah, yeah. I love that. Yeah. As we sort of start to wrap things up, I was wondering if I could ask some sort of more broader questions, actually. Yeah, about how you think, really. Yeah. And the first one is, it's a simple question. If we could take you to one place on the planet and you could see one species. I was reading about your profile. I read that you've seen gorillas and sharks and turtles and so forth. Where would you go and what would you like to see?
Oh my God. Oh, that's such a tough question.
You're well traveled, so it's a tough one. Yeah.
Yeah. I almost got to go to Patagonia. I'd love to go there. And if given half a chance, hop down from there to Antarctica. I mean, somewhere completely different. But then I've for some reason always been interested in going to Bhutan as well, because again, I think they have a quite a different philosophy and, you know, different values than in other places. So I suppose those would be the places that I would. And what I love is it's not so much an individual species, but all the unexpected things that you find. So I took some extended leave over Christmas and was lucky enough to visit my sister-in-law in Kenya. And yes, it's amazing seeing sort of lions and elephants, but one evening it rained and all the bushes around the camp we were at were lit up by fireflies. I've never seen that before. And in the roof next to my sister-in-law's house, some bush babies lived in the roof, and at 20 to 7 each evening they would poke their little heads out with their big eyes, and you could watch them sort of emerge and leap into the bushes. So it's all the sort of little things. I mean, and that comes back to almost your first question about that. What is amazing in Kenya is that amazing web of life, from predators down to the smallest species, and the fact and the abundance within it. That's what really inspires me.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Biodiversity, nature, wildlife, whatever we want to call it, is in decline globally. You know, we're all doing our best to kind of turn that tide around, but the stats show that we're failing as a conservation community. What do we need to do more of or be better at, in your view, if we're really going to turn this around as a conservation movement?
In Britain?
Or globally, yeah, answer as you wish. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think first, I mean, again, in Britain, I think we have to see, and it all comes down to what we're asking of the land and sea, and seeing that rewilding can bring multiple benefits, and is a valid, viable and productive use of the land and sea in relation to the in relation to what we're asking in the 21st century. So I think we need to shift that. I mean, again, one of the things that we're more explicitly doing at Rewilding Britain is taking a sort of systems transformation approach. I mean, if you want the scale of change that we need to have happen, we have to change mindsets and shift paradigms, and we have to create an enabling environment in terms of policy and research and technology, and we have to have lots of people making changes on the ground that can start to shift what's, you know, the way things are done. And so I think it's about taking a combination of those approaches. But you can, I mean, I have to remain hopeful that sometimes those tipping points seem to be unachievable, but sometimes they can shift. If you get the right combination of changes at each of those levels, then they can shift suddenly. So, you know, an example might be, it used to be commonplace to just burn stubble. You would see it every year, and the clouds of smoke and pollution and accidents it's caused, and it seemed to be an intractable problem. Everyone said, no, that's just how we need to do things. And then suddenly it shifted and it became totally unacceptable and completely stopped. So it's how do we reach that tipping point where it just becomes part of the way that we manage land and sea? I think so I've got to remain hopeful that that's possible, and that's what we're orientated towards, helping to move and create those tipping points.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. And hope is my final question, actually. Yeah. We've mentioned it a few times, like during our chat just now, but also you talked about being hopeful during your job hunt when you're unemployed for a year or so, and hope that is shown within rewilding and the change that it can bring. How do you maintain optimism? How do you maintain your hope? How do you stay positive, I think is my question. Yeah.
I suppose unsurprisingly, it's about connecting with nature for me. As I said, the joys of going out and watching bluefin tuna leap out of the sea 20 meters from where you're standing, or I've turned into one of those wild swimming nuts and swimming in the sea, which doesn't necessarily help those that maybe it does, in your job hunting, or when those moments where you feel despondent and that you're not moving along the path that you want to be. I suppose it's reconnecting with that sense of purpose and place, and again coming back to values, and not losing hope.
Wonderful. Rebecca, thanks again so much for jumping on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. If people want to find out more about Rewilding Britain, your work, maybe get involved, where should they go?
Well, we have a website, so hopefully there's a lot of information about what we do, and you can sign up as a supporter of Rewilding Britain, so getting regular updates. If you're involved in rewilding, you can contact us about joining the Rewilding Network. You'd be very welcome. And so that's a more kind of active community. So there's various different levels of involvement and engagement. Most of the information can be found through our website.
Wonderful. And we'll drop a link in the show notes. And yeah, that's great. Okay, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. If you did, then please do hit the subscribe button to get notified of new episodes as they drop. And also please give us a rating or a review, because it really helps us to get in front of more people, and we really enjoy reading them all. As you'll have heard, our podcasts are now recorded in front of a live audience who sit in and listen to the chat, and then after the mics are turned off, they get a chance to talk to the host, to share their thoughts, and also to ask questions. It's a really great format. If you'd like to be in the audience, all you need to do is join the Conservation Careers Academy. Now, in the Conservation Careers Academy, you'll get full access to the world's biggest conservation job board, listing over 15,000 jobs, volunteer and internships across the globe each year. You'll also enjoy access to our amazing CC Pro private members community with regular events, networking and support. Plus, you'll get full access to our growing library of career-boosting resources, guides and templates. And best of all, it only costs a few dollars, euros or pounds per month to join the Academy. Now, to find out more, please visit conservation-careers.com/academy, or simply click the join button at the top of our website. See you on the inside.